What if everything you thought you knew about Merlin was wrong? Not just slightly off, not just a twist in the tale, but profoundly, hauntingly, deliciously wrong. Forget the kindly old man in the pointy hat. Forget the quiet advisor at King Arthur's side. That version, the polished, patient wizard, is a later invention, a bedtime story, a sanitized myth built over centuries to make something wild and dangerous feel tame. But the real Merlin, the one buried beneath layers of ink and time, he was something else entirely. For more than 800 years, his story has survived in fragments. A whisper in a Welsh poem, a strange verse in a French romance, a scribble in the margins of a crumbling manuscript. He was part prophet, part trickster, part child of the forest. A figure too unruly for the church, too magical for historians, too strange to fully erase. His name echoed through time like a ghost that wouldn't rest. And then, just recently, something happened. A plain, dusty book, tucked away on a quiet shelf in Cambridge University Library, the kind of volume no one looks at twice, was opened. Just a 16th century register of old property deeds. Nothing mysterious, nothing magical. Until someone looked a little closer at the cover and realized that the cover wasn't a cover at all. It was a mask. And underneath that mask was Merlin. Not the Merlin we remember, the Merlin we forgot, the one we tried to leave behind. An ordinary book, an extraordinary secret. It began with a book no one was supposed to notice, hidden deep in the archives of Cambridge University Library, among rows of volumes long forgotten. A plain ledger rested in silence. It was the kind of book you pass by without a second thought. Bound in brown leather, worn at the edges, smelling faintly of dust and old paper. A 16th century register from Suffolk, used to track property deeds and land holdings for a manor house called Huntingfield. Not a spellbook, not a chronicle of kings, just paperwork. It had been catalogued by librarians, logged into the system, even put on display once or twice. A curiosity from the Elizabethan age, but no one ever looked too hard. Because why would they? Until one day someone did. They opened it not for magic, but for metadata. But as they turned the pages, their fingers brushed the inside of the cover, and something felt off. The material wasn't quite right. The stitching looked rushed, uneven, as if someone had cobbled it together in a hurry. That's when they realized the truth. The binding wasn't original. It was a patchwork. And the patches weren't just leather. They were parchment, torn scraps of older documents, cut and folded to reinforce a book that had nothing to do with them. Scraps from another world. One fragment in particular caught their eye, yellowed, wrinkled, barely legible, but unmistakably written in medieval French, a language that hadn't been widely spoken in England since the 14th century. A language of courts, of knights, of lost romances, and then, barely visible among the faded ink, one word, faint, repeating, Merlin, again and again, like an echo stitched into silence. Merlin, that name, faint and ghostly, woven into the cracks of ancient parchment, changed everything. What the researchers had uncovered wasn't a spell, nor a random medieval scribble. It was a fragment, a surviving piece of one of the rarest literary artifacts from the Middle Ages, the Suite Vulgate du Merlin, a name that means little to most, but in the world of Arthurian legend, it's gold dust. This wasn't just another tale. It was part of a 13th century continuation of the Merlin story. One of the few surviving branches that dared to extend the myth beyond what most people know. Fewer than 40 manuscripts of this suite exist in the world, and none of them are alike. Each copy was handmade, each word inked by candlelight, each scribe interpreting, adapting, sometimes altering what they believed Merlin should be. No two versions tell the same story. It's like watching history whisper through 1,000 voices, all speaking about the same man, but seeing him through different eyes. But this version, this tattered hidden scrap buried in a book of land deeds, it might be the strangest of all, because what it reveals isn't the wise old wizard from children's books, but something far older, far wilder, a Merlin most of us have never met. and perhaps were never meant to. The fragment they couldn't touch, but there was a problem, a serious one. The fragment they had found, the scrap of medieval parchment with Merlin's name dancing through it, wasn't lying flat between the pages like a misplaced letter. It had been folded deep into the inner spine of the book, tucked, pressed, and stitched so tightly into the cover that any attempt to unfold it by hand could tear it to pieces. The creases were centuries old, sharp as blades, and the parchment itself had grown fragile, like dry autumn leaves that crumble under pressure. One wrong move, and the story would be lost forever. In earlier times, scholars faced a cruel choice: destroy one part of a manuscript to preserve another. They would have carefully and painfully cut through the cover, slicing away the ancient layers just to get a glimpse of what lay beneath. And in doing so, they would have damaged something else. One truth sacrificed for another, a necessary compromise, a quiet tragedy. But not this time. This time, they had something medieval scribes could never have imagined: light, lenses, and digital resurrection. Instead of blades, they used multispectral imaging, technology capable of capturing what the human eye can't see. They scanned it with macro lenses, revealing the ghostly ink hidden in the creases. They even used CT scanning, the kind usually reserved for medical diagnostics, to virtually unwrap the parchment without ever touching it. Layer by layer, word by word, they digitally unfolded a page that had been silent for over 700 years. Not a single fiber disturbed, not a single thread cut. It was a forensic miracle, a quiet moment of resurrection in the back room of a library. And when the words finally came into view, they revealed a Merlin no one was expecting. Not the courtly magician, not the gentle sage, but something stranger, wilder, and far more ancient. The Merlin who refused to behave. Forget the familiar picture. The wise court magician with a long white beard, leaning gently toward kings and whispering measured advice. That image is comfortable, safe. It belongs on stained glass windows and children's books. But the Merlin hidden in this manuscript was nothing like that. He was unpredictable, untamed, and more importantly, alive in a way that the polished legend never is. In this version, Merlin doesn't stand beside Arthur as a dignified sage. He drifts on the edges of the world like a riddle in human form. At one moment, he appears as a blind harpist, a wandering musician whose sightless eyes look straight into the soul. Blindness, in medieval symbolism, wasn't weakness. It suggested inner sight, vision beyond vision, the ability to see what others could not. He is not helpless. He is attuned to something no one else can hear. And then, without explanation, this same Merlin appears again as a child, small, bald, barefoot, and very much not wearing trousers. A sight at once absurd and unsettling, yet the child speaks with authority, royal authority. He issues commands to knights and kings without hesitation, as if the world should kneel simply because he has spoken. The court obeys, though no one understands why. This is not a joke, not mockery. Medieval audiences would have understood it immediately. Children could symbolize innocence, rebirth, direct access to truth unfiltered by pride or power. And nudity? In medieval thought, it could represent pure revelation, the human soul stripped of pretense. Merlin in this form is truth without disguise, a being without shame because he has nothing to hide. And then comes the moment that changes the tone entirely. In the fragment, the child Merlin asks King Arthur for permission to carry the battle standard into war. It sounds foolish, ridiculous, even dangerous, a barefoot boy on a battlefield. But Arthur agrees. The battle begins, the chaos rises, and Merlin returns, not as a child anymore, but leading a fire-breathing dragon that turns the tide of war. Yes, a dragon. To medieval minds, a dragon was not simply a monster. It was a symbol of power, ancestry, fate, and the primal forces of the land itself. A dragon was a banner made flesh, the living embodiment of destiny. So when Merlin brings a dragon, he is not just calling magic. He is revealing who he is. Because according to legend, Merlin was born to a mortal woman and a demon, not blessed, not cursed, something in between, a bridge between worlds, human enough to understand suffering, otherworldly enough to shape the course of history. The medieval mind loved the idea that greatness came from the borderlands, from the places where light and shadow touched. This Merlin is not safe. He is not gentle. He is not predictable. He is wonder and fear intertwined. And he refuses to behave. The Merlin who refused to behave. Forget everything you've been told about Merlin. The solemn old man in a pointed hat. The quiet counselor who stands behind the throne, nodding wisely as kings decide the fate of kingdoms. That version came later, much later, smoothed out, sanded down, made safe for bedtime stories and school plays. But this Merlin, the one who emerged from that forgotten fragment in Cambridge, he refused to behave. This Merlin wasn't a wise old sage. He was a blind harpist, wandering the edges of Arthur's early reign, a haunting presence, not quite man, not quite myth. Then he vanishes, only to return in a form that defies reason. A balding child, barefoot and half naked, issuing royal commands with the authority of a monarch and none of the modesty. And yes, he really wasn't wearing trousers, not for shock value, for symbolism. We'll come back to that. In one of the most striking scenes from the manuscript, this strange child approaches Arthur, wild-eyed, fragile, but certain, and asks to carry the royal standard into battle. Arthur hesitates, but agrees. And when the trumpets sound and the war begins, Merlin doesn't just arrive with a banner. He arrives with a fire-breathing dragon. No, that's not a metaphor. This child sorcerer, born of shadows and visions, conjures a living dragon onto the battlefield. A creature of smoke and flame, rage and glory. It turns the tide of war, not just because of the fire, but because of what it means. In the medieval world, dragons weren't just monsters. They were power incarnate. They symbolized ancient bloodlines, divine wrath, and untamable magic. They were messengers of fate. And here, Merlin didn't just summon one. He was one, a living force of prophecy and fire. And that brings us to the darkest root of his legend. Madman, prophet, son of the devil. This is the part most retellings leave out. The part that makes modern readers and medieval scribes uncomfortable. In many of the earliest accounts, Merlin's father wasn't just absent, he was unholy, a literal demon. Not in the figurative sense, not a bad man or a violent warrior, but an actual spirit of darkness, an incubus, a being from the underworld. His mother, a mortal woman, innocent, virtuous. Some stories say she was a nun, or at least pledged to chastity. She had never known a man, but one night, in a whisper of shadow and fire, something else came to her. And from that union, unwanted, unexplainable, a child was born, a child who could speak of things no one else could see. A child who knew secrets he had no way of knowing. A child who walked the line between the sacred and the damned. He could conjure storms, read hearts, speak truths not yet written. But he didn't act like a prophet. He didn't recite scripture or call people to repentance. He didn't serve the church, and he didn't ask for forgiveness. He was too strange for sainthood, too powerful for comfort, and too useful to ignore. In the Christian world of medieval Europe, supernatural gifts came with strings attached. You could only get power from one of two sources. Either from God, which made you a prophet, a saint, a holy servant, or from the devil, which made you dangerous, deceptive, and cursed. There was no middle ground, but Merlin was the middle ground. To make sense of him, writers invented a compromise. They said he was born of a demon, yes, but baptized at birth. Saved, just enough. Tainted, but touched by grace. His blood was impure, but his soul might be redeemable. He wasn't holy, he wasn't damned. He was both. It was the perfect theological loophole, a brilliant workaround. He could be a sorcerer without being a heretic. He could carry the weight of prophecy without threatening the order of the church. He could dance along the edges of chaos without fully crossing the line. And so, Merlin became a man the world could never fully claim. Holy and haunted, feared and followed. A riddle, not just in his words, but in his very nature. Before the myths, before the sword. The wild-eyed, shape-shifting Merlin of the fragment is not an invention of a bored medieval scribe. He didn't appear out of nowhere as a strange poetic experiment. He came from something far older, a memory that lived in the land long before Arthur sat on a throne, long before scribes dipped quills in ink, long before stories were softened for polite company, centuries before the image of Merlin as the wise court magician became standard. There were whispers of a figure called Merlin Wilt, the wild Merlin, not a robed scholar, not a gentle advisor, a man of the borderlands, a bard, a soldier, a keeper of stories and ancestral memory. And then, a madman. Merlin Wilt appears in some of the earliest Welsh poems, not as a magician in a tower, but as a broken warrior. He had fought in a real battle, the Battle of Arthuried in the 6th century, a brutal conflict between rival Celtic kings. This was no mythic war of dragons and banners. It was mud, blood, screams. The kind of battle where the sky feels too small to hold the dead. Something in that battle shattered him. He is said to have watched friends, comrades, brothers in arms fall one by one. The field was drowned in grief. And when it was over, Merlin did not return home. He fled, into the woods, into the dark, into a silence so deep it almost swallowed him. He lived among animals, slept beneath trees, spoke only in riddles and fractured visions. To the world, he was mad. But his madness was threaded with prophecy. His brokenness hummed with meaning. And here comes the part medieval listeners understood instinctively. In their worldview, madness and revelation were not opposites. They were neighbors, sometimes even twins. The ones who walked too close to the edge of the world, who saw too much, felt too deeply, were the ones who could glimpse what lay beyond it. Merlin's madness was terrifying, yes, but it was also compelling. People sought him out. They wanted to hear what he saw, because buried inside that chaos was something sharp, something bright, something that rang true, a warning, a vision, a destiny. This was the Merlin that came before the myths, before Camelot, before the sword and the stone, before chivalry smoothed all the sharp edges and made him safe for royal halls. A Merlin of the forest, of the storm, of the wound that never healed. And it is this wild, fractured, dangerous Merlin, not the courtly sage, who slips back into view in the Cambridge manuscript, a ghost returning, a truth resurfacing, the Merlin who refuses to be tamed. Before the myths, before the sword, long before Merlin became the bearded advisor we think we know, before Excalibur, before the Round Table, before the polished myths of knights and noble quests, there was another story, one far older, one carved not into books, but into the landscape itself. That wild-eyed, shape-shifting child from the Cambridge manuscript. He wasn't a literary invention. He wasn't a flight of medieval imagination. He was a memory. Centuries before the French romances, before Geoffrey of Monmouth picked up his quill, people in the British Isles were already whispering about Merlin Wilt. Merlin the Wild, not a wizard, not yet, but a soldier, a bard, a man who once stood on the battlefield and broke. According to early legends, Merlin fought in a real war, the Battle of Arthuried, in what is now southern Scotland. It happened in the 6th century, no shining armor, no banners waving, just mud, blood, and betrayal. When the battle ended, Merlin had lost everything, his comrades, his cause, and his grip on reality. He fled into the forest, and there, among the trees and the beasts, something changed. He stopped speaking plainly. He began to speak in riddles, in visions, in fragments of poetry that seemed to see into the soul of things. He avoided people, but when he did appear, they listened, not out of pity, but because something in his madness felt like truth. He howled at the moon. He wept over streams. He spoke of events that hadn't yet happened. And though some called him broken, others saw a man touched by forces no one could name. And that's where the earliest Merlin was born. Not in a castle, but in the woods. Not in robes, but in rags. Not as a king's advisor, but as a haunted soul who saw too much. Madness and prophecy. two sides of the same coin. In the medieval mind, madness and insight were never far apart. A prophet wasn't necessarily a priest. More often, he was an outsider, a loner, a wanderer, someone who didn't fit. He lived on the fringes, ate little, slept less, and spoke in ways that made others uncomfortable. But uncomfortable didn't mean wrong. The wildness, the strange speech, the unpredictable behavior, it wasn't just tolerated, it was feared, revered, because people believed madness could be a sign that maybe, just maybe, those who were cracked were also closer to the divine, or to something even older than the divine. Merlin wasn't the only one. Other names surfaced through the fog of early folklore, Lilachan, for example, another solitary figure who wandered the hills, mumbling about fate and fire, stars and kings. In some stories, he and Merlin are one and the same. In others, they are echoes of each other, fragments of the same archetype. The wild man of the woods, neither villain nor hero, not quite sane, not entirely lost, a liminal being, someone who had stepped one foot out of the human world and never fully came back. But as the centuries rolled on, stories changed. The chaos began to shrink. Writers, especially those serving the church or the court, started trimming the rough edges. They took the madness out of Merlin, or tried to. They made him rational, respectable. They dressed him in robes, gave him titles, made him speak like a gentleman. But in doing so, they buried something ancient, something raw. Because the original Merlin wasn't just a character, he was a warning, a mirror, a reminder that truth, the deep, uncomfortable kind, doesn't always come from temples or thrones. Sometimes it comes from a man in rags, sitting alone in the trees, whispering a future no one wants to hear. The cleric who tamed Merlin. The forest grew quiet. The wild man's voice, once echoing through trees and storms, began to fade. And then, in the 12th century, something unexpected happened. A pen was lifted, and Merlin was rewritten. The man holding that pen was a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth, not a bard, not a warrior, a churchman trained in Latin and scripture, a man of order, structure, power. He looked at the scattered fragments of the Merlin myth, the riddles, the madness, the pagan whispers, and decided to give them shape. He didn't just write about Merlin, he tamed him. In Geoffrey's hands, the wild prophet of the woods became something very different, a seer of destiny, a political oracle, a holy tool for kings. Merlin could now foresee royal bloodlines, invasions, betrayals. He could predict the death of tyrants and the birth of heroes. Most importantly, and most conveniently, he could foresee the future of Britain itself. He wasn't just a character anymore. He was a national symbol, a magical stamp of approval on the divine right of kings, a sorcerer in service of the crown. And Geoffrey, he didn't present this as myth. He didn't wink. He didn't hedge. He claimed it was all real, that he was simply translating an ancient book written in the British tongue, a source text no one else ever saw, a phantom manuscript that, conveniently, validated everything he wanted to say. And yet, it worked. His book, The Prophecies of Merlin, spread across Europe like wildfire. Translated, adapted, quoted. Monarchs began using its passages to justify their power. Nobles pointed to Merlin's words as proof of their destiny. For many, it was no longer a story, it was scripture. And from that moment on, Merlin changed. The wild-eyed boy with no trousers, gone. The madman who whispered to trees, forgotten. In his place stood a robed scholar, calm, controlled, respectable. He sat beside kings, not under stars. He spoke of politics, not visions. He was safe now, useful. He had been pulled out of the forest and placed firmly at court. But in taming Merlin, something was lost, something primal, something terrifying, something true. And for centuries, that original version, the one who burned like a lightning strike in the dark, remained buried, until now. But something was lost. This transformation, from ragged forest prophet to polished royal advisor, made Merlin easier to understand, easier to admire, easier to teach to children. But in the process, something essential slipped away. The danger, the unpredictability, the sense that he was not entirely of this world. The original Merlin was not comfortable. He was not meant to make you feel safe. He was meant to unsettle you, to stand half in shadow, half in light, and make you wonder which side he truly belonged to. When Geoffrey and the later French romance writers cleaned him up, they didn't just alter the story, they changed the temperature of the myth. They took a flame and turned it into a candle, warm, decorative, harmless. But the newly discovered manuscript? It doesn't obey that version, and that is what makes it extraordinary. This fragment was written between the years 1275 and 1315, exactly when the courtly Merlin had already taken over the imagination of Europe. By all logic, the Merlin in this manuscript should have been wise, controlled, robed, serene, a loyal advisor, a voice of orderly destiny. But that is not who appears on the page. The Merlin in this fragment refuses to be tamed. He slips through forms and meanings like water through fingers. He is a barefoot child, pale and unsettling, issuing commands no one understands, yet everyone obeys. He is a blind bard, listening to a music only he can hear, singing truths that no scholar or priest can translate. He is a shapeshifter, a trickster, a figure who stands just beyond the reach of logic. And then, as if to remind us he is not bound by our world's rules, he calls a dragon into battle. Not a symbol, not a metaphor, but a living embodiment of power, fury, and ancient fire. This is not the Merlin of polished courts. This is a man balanced between heaven and hell, a being touched by the divine and the demonic, a reminder that prophecy is not gentle, that magic is not safe, and that the oldest stories were never meant to be comforting. This Merlin is the storm before the kingdom, not the peace that comes after it, the one we tried to forget, the one who has now returned. Symbols that speak louder than words. Nothing in this manuscript is accidental. Medieval storytellers didn't choose images carelessly. Every gesture, every object, every physical detail carried layers of meaning that a medieval audience would have recognized instantly, even if we no longer see them today. The fragment does not describe events literally. It speaks in symbols, in mythic vocabulary, in images that are meant to reveal rather than explain. Take the blind harpist. To us, blindness may suggest vulnerability, but in medieval and earlier Celtic tradition, the blind were often believed to see more than the sighted, not with their eyes, but with something deeper. Blindness suggested inward vision, second sight, the ability to perceive hidden truths. And the harp he plays? That is not a casual choice. In Celtic culture, the harp was a sacred instrument. Bards were not entertainers. They were the carriers of memory, the keepers of history, the ones who spoke for the ancestors. They preserved the identity of the people. They were revered, feared, respected. To be a blind bard was to be a bridge, one who sees the unseen and sings what others dare not say. Now consider the child without trousers. On the surface, it sounds absurd, even comical to a modern ear. But medieval symbolic language understood nakedness in a completely different way. Clothing was identity, rank, social mask. To be unclothed was to be unfiltered, unmasked, pure. In Christian thought, the naked child symbolized innocence before the world teaches shame. And in Celtic and Druidic tradition, nudity could indicate truth. Truth so strong it could not be dressed, softened, or disguised. So this child Merlin is not foolish. He is revelation itself. He speaks without hesitation because he speaks without pretense. And then, the dragon. To us, dragons belong to fairy tales, but to the medieval mind, they were symbols of sovereignty, of ancestral power, of ancient right. In Welsh tradition, the red dragon was the emblem of the Old Britons, the first peoples of the land. It was the spirit of the nation, a symbol of struggle and endurance. Legends said it lived beneath the earth itself, its breath rising in smoke from hilltops. When Merlin summons a dragon to the battlefield, he is not merely conjuring a monster. He is calling forth the oldest identity of Britain, its soul, its fury, its memory. He is declaring that Arthur's rule is not just political. It is cosmic, it is fated, written into the earth and sky, and the manuscript goes further. Merlin does not simply command the dragon. He becomes it. That is the key. That is the symbol. He is not a mere magician waving spells. He is transformation, liminality, the place where human and myth meet and dissolve, a being who is not bound by one form, one meaning, one truth, a creature who can shift between worlds because he belongs to both. He is the forest and the court, chaos and order, divine and demonic, past and future. He is the part of us that refuses to be simplified, and the fragment reveals what centuries of polite storytelling tried to hide. Merlin was never meant to make us comfortable. He was meant to make us feel. The Merlin we buried, and the one who came back. For centuries we've buried him, not with shovels, but with stories. We buried him beneath layers of Latin and lace, beneath courtly romances and carefully edited chronicles. We smoothed out his edges, we quieted his voice. We replaced the howling wild man with a soft-spoken sage, gave him robes instead of rags, a title instead of terror. We made him easier to teach, easier to praise, easier to forget. But he never really left. The wild Merlin, the one born of forest and fire, madness and music, is kept whispering. You could still find pieces of him if you looked hard enough, in old songs sung by shepherds, in the margins of medieval manuscripts, scribbled by monks with shaky hands, in poems that didn't quite rhyme, and stories that never made it to print. He lived on in fragments, waiting. And now, thanks to a forgotten book, a folded page, and a scanner that sees deeper than human eyes, he's returned. Not as a fantasy, but as a fact. The dragon summoner, the blind bard, the barefoot boy who walked between worlds, the Merlin who didn't care for crowns or cathedrals, the Merlin who belonged to no one, and yet shaped everything. His fire is still burning. Quiet, yes, but hot. You can feel it in the lines of that rediscovered manuscript, in the creases of parchment, in the flicker of ink, in the breathless moment when 700 years of silence finally broke. The madness, the magic, the mystery, the child of darkness, who helped build a kingdom of light. And if that doesn't make your skin tingle, just wait, because Merlin's not the only figure we've rewritten, softened, silenced. There are other stories, other voices, other pages still waiting to be turned.